I want to add my thanks to the committee. Most of us, other than Bill and I, were not involved in previous Mullan Road committees and did not know what they were getting into. And so Cheryl and Anna and Scott, and they poured their heart into something that they didn't really know what it was. And I think that's the way it is every year at these Mullan Road conferences, because we start anew every city we go to. So we are sponsored in part by grants. One was from Missoula County and the Historical Museum here, the Preserving Missoula County History Grant. We also got a grant from Humanities Montana, and we have speakers today who are Humanities Montana speakers as a bonus. MCAT, Missoula Community Access TV, is filming the whole procedure today. In the back there, we received a grant from them, and that'll be available, I think, in the future on YouTube and on their website, etc. We'll let everybody know when that comes about. Our funding mechanisms are through Friends of Two Rivers and the Bonner Milltown History Center, which I'm part of, and is a vital, if aging, group of historians out in the Bonner Milltown area. Another special thank you to a guy who's going to be speaking later on, but every time we had a question, we turned to Ken Robison in Great Falls and Fort Benton for an answer, how to go about this. And within minutes, it seemed, I got the emails from Ken. So I'd like you to everybody to give Ken a hand. We'll give him another one. Thank you, Ken. We, Matt from the Historical Museum of Fort Missoula was our welcomer, but we don't give them enough credit for the help that they have done, and Tate from his museum next door, the Military Museum, for helping us get this building and for just being supportive of whenever we were. We hope you have time to take a look around the campus here at Fort Missoula, because there's some amazing stuff here. And some of it applies to the Mullan Road. Another thank you to the property owners who graciously let us take hikes on their properties yesterday. One is Ron Manahan, who you'll be hearing from later this afternoon. The other, when the hike east was on property with two property owners that we got permission, Tom Ewell opened his gate to us to take a walk on 3 Mile Grade. And the adjacent property owner also was willing and able and enthusiastic about us taking a look at that historic place. And that's about it. I hope you have a chance to look around at the displays here, and it's time to go.
I got one more thing before we jump into our next speaker. I put something special together here, I hope. Kay, could you come on up? Kay Strombo. I don't know how many of you know Kay. She's been around a bit, but I put this together for Kay, and it's the mother of the Mullan Road Award, presented.
I knew John personally.
Presented to Kay Strombo for 35 years of dedication as the founder of Mullan Days. That's got a couple pictures on the front of them. One is her museum in Superior, and John Mullan statue, and then a logo from today's conference. Okay, I think our next speaker was gonna, I'm gonna get him started heading this way, and I'll introduce him while he's getting here, because he might take a while. I'm honored to introduce Professor T. William J. Youngs, I think that's where it was, AKA Bill, okay? If you want to have his pedigree in history, etc., you can go on the Eastern Washington University website. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about Bill the Mullanite. And Bill has been involved with Mullan Days for probably at least 20 years. He's helped organize a number of them in Walla Walla and in Cheney and in Spokane. His students under his leadership over I don't know how many years I'm not sure how they did it, but they put on computer the Mullan Report, the major report. So Bill's really a dedicated Mullanite, and I'm proud to have him here. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to start by thanking Bill, the other Bill. It's always awkward at these conferences. Somebody says something complimentary and I'm feeling all glowing, and I realize that they're saying it about the other Bill, but okay. I first want to indicate that a colleague and student, former student, now a colleague at Eastern of mine, Jake Ream, gave a talk at the meeting in Fort Benton last year on monuments and has now published an article on that. And I wish we had 400 copies, but we have at least one, and I'd like to be passing it around. So Ken, could you start it going? And I think probably the thumbs, as I get into my talk, I'll start doing this. So just give me the thumbs up and I'll realize you're not saying, "Great job, Bill," you're saying, "Speak louder, you jerk." Okay. Most of your tables have a picture of Madison Junction, and Jake has a few extra copies he can pass around if you don't have that. It's before there were computers and slide projectors and stuff. There were paper photographs, and so I'll be referring to that. I always like, when possible, to link in a talk I'm giving with what came before, and I thought that Sadie and Thompson, those were both magnificent, and I love the way they fit together. And they do on a couple of themes I want to pick up, and we'll see how I try to weave into them. But one is Thompson mentioned the terrible impact on the environment of the whole westward movement, and starting with John Mullan and afterwards. And my talk does tie into this, in that at that same time when we were ravaging the environment, it was also the time of John Muir and others who were beginning to talk about the beauty of nature, Emerson before that, Thoreau, and that is going to be part of what I'm linking into today is the Yellowstone National Park and the value, the idealism behind it. Also, though, it's going to tie in terms of oral history and just how we know the truth about history. And that's where this photograph, I'll be building on it, but it is a photograph of Madison Junction in Yellowstone Park, where supposedly, and I believe it did happen, there was a conversation about a little over 150 years ago where early explorers said we should make this a national park. And the monument, you can just barely see it in that photograph. There's something called National Park Monument Mountain right behind it. And there's a monument in front of it that honors those people. Now, I'll go into this much more deeply going forward, but that has been dismissed by many scholars in the park system as being untrue, that it never happened, that conversation never happened. I hope to persuade you and to make you devoted advocates of the fact that, darn it, it is true. And we've got to get the park to change that. And at any rate, that's my other tie-in, just how we do history and how we restore the past, how we honor the past. So, getting into the talk, I plan to show you today that our friend John Mullan had a role, albeit a cameo role, in the creation of Yellowstone National Park. Along the way, we will explore two subjects. First, we will review the early history of the discovery of Yellowstone up to the Langford-Washburn expedition of 1870. Along the way, we will learn how Nathaniel Langford's reading of the Mullan Report encouraged Langford to undertake the expedition. Second, we will look at a campfire conversation that occurred toward the end of the expedition and explore its influence on the creation of Yellowstone National Park. The story of this conversation is sometimes mistakenly called the campfire myth or the campfire legend. The park now embraces the view that the event never took place. I will review the arguments of the debunkers and then argue on behalf of restoring Montana pioneers to their rightful position as the premier advocates for the world's first national park. And you, those of you from Montana may cheer if you like. Okay. The wonders of Yellowstone were discovered many times by many different individuals and groups. Indians, of course, came first. A report by the United States Geological Service declares a century and a half does not even begin to approach the true stretch of history that encompass human exploration and occupation of the Yellowstone region. In realities, hunter-gatherers have been interacting with Yellowstone for at least the past 11,000 years, and we saw that illustrated nicely in the previous talk by Thompson. During the early 19th century, white hunters and trappers came to Yellowstone, few of whom left any record of their adventures. John Coulter was one exception. A member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he stayed in the West, traveled extensively in the Rocky Mountains, and described remarkable geysers that he claimed to have seen deep in the wilderness. But he was regarded as a storyteller rather than an accurate reporter, and his fantasy land came to be known as Coulter's Hell. Coulter died in the second decade of the 19th century. His successor as foremost storyteller in the West was Jim Bridger, who was born the same year that Lewis and Clark left Missoula on their journey to the Pacific. Bridger also told stories of the Yellowstone country, and he too was regarded as a fabricator. As if the actual wonders of Yellowstone were not enough, Bridger claimed to have seen a petrified forest where petrified birds sang petrified songs. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It's true. Oh, it's true, okay. I wish it were, yeah. No wonder that after his death in 1881, it was said that his tombstone should read, "Here lies Jim Bridger." Given the abundance of these fanciful tales, we should not be surprised that a few pioneers, armed with curiosity and a spirit of adventure, should want to see the Upper Yellowstone for themselves. Nathaniel Langford, one of these pioneers, came west in 1862 with a group of immigrants headed for the Salmon River goldfields. Their journey of 1,300 miles from St. Paul took them through Fort Benton and thence likely along a portion of the recently completed Mullan Road. Langford spent his next 2 years in Bannock and Virginia City, Montana, a lawless frontier where he helped establish freight companies and a sawmill, along with law and order. He later wrote a history called Vigilante Days and Ways. Upon arriving in Montana, Langford tells us he frequently heard rumors of the existence of wonderful phenomena in the Upper Yellowstone. He hoped one day to visit the region, but was deterred by the presence of unusual and insurmountable dangers, in his words. He tells us that the Upper Yellowstone was at the time inhabited only by wild beasts and roving bands of hostile Indians. A few trappers had visited the area, but as they were all believed to be romancers, their stories were received with great distrust. Now, Langford would soon meet Jim Bridger, the most famous of these romancers. He tells us, "I first became acquainted with Bridger in the year 1866. He, Langford, was then employed by a wagon company. Bridger was employed by a wagon company of which Langford was president. Bridger told me of the existence of hot spouting springs and said that he'd seen a column of water as large as his body sprout as high as the flagpole in Virginia City, which was about 60 feet high. Maybe so, maybe not. What was Langford to believe? And now John Mullan enters the story. Langford tells us what finally convinced him of the truth of Bridger's tale. I was the more disposed to credit his statement, Langford writes, because of what I had previously read in the report of Captain John Mullan, made to the War Department. From my present examination of that report, which was made in February 14, 1863, and a copy of which I still have in my possession, and this is writing 35 years later, I find that Captain Mullan says, I learned from the Indians, and afterwards confirmed by my own explorations, the fact of the existence of an infinite number of hot springs in the headwaters of the Missouri, Columbia, and Yellowstone rivers, still quoting from Mullan, and that hot geysers similar to those of California exist at the head of the Yellowstone. Langford's enthusiasm for visiting the upper Yellowstone was thus nurtured by a notion that lying Jim Bridger might be telling the truth, and confirmed by the fact that reliable John Mullan reported that he had actually seen hot geysers in the region. Langford tells us that in 1866 he began considering an expedition, but he says these efforts ended in nothing more than a general discussion of the subject of an exploration. He and other prospective explorers were deterred by the threatened outbreaks of Indians in the Gallatin Valley. Nonetheless, during 1869, another Montana pioneer, David Folsom, one of the immigrants who migrated to Montana with Nathaniel Langford, took part in a small exploration party, and this again is 1869. Folsom and two friends traveled to the Yellowstone Lake and Lower Geyser Basin and returned safely to the settlements. Langford reports that the account Folsom gave him and a few others, quote, renewed in us our determination to visit that region the following year, 1870. While many Montanans at first expressed interest in joining the new Yellowstone expedition, news of Indian hostilities in the region led some of them to experience, in Langford's words, a decline of courage. From a large body of volunteers, the Yellowstone party dwindled down to 8. That left a small group of Montanans to answer the call of adventure. And indeed, curiosity alone motivated them to journey into the Yellowstone wilderness. They were not seeking gold or other treasure, and no one was paying them to join the expedition. In fact, they paid their own expenses. Each had an important position in the new territory of Montana. Langford said of them, I question if there ever was a body of men organized for an exploring expedition more intelligent and more keenly alive to the risks they encountered once they enrolled. General Henry D. Washburn, the elected leader of the expedition, was Surveyor General of Montana and had served 2 terms in Congress. The company also included a distinguished judge, the president of a Helena Bank, 2 Helena merchants, and 2 Internal Revenue assessors. One of the members was the son of United States Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, and Langford himself was a United States Collector of Internal Revenue for Montana and had nearly become territorial governor. These men gathered at Fort Ellis, the jumping-off point for the expedition. Here, an Army escort of 6 soldiers joined the company, 2 packers, and 2 cooks brought the total to 18. The members of the Washburn-Langford expedition would spend slightly more than a month in Yellowstone country. Fascinating episodes abound, and I'm currently working on a book about the expedition, which will tell many of those stories. For our purposes today, I will focus on 2 of those episodes as illustrations of the quality of the expedition as a whole. And in particular, I will share Nathaniel Langford's description of 2 iconic regions of the modern park, Yellowstone Falls and the Upper Geyser Basin. Here for a start is how Langford describes Yellowstone Falls. I'm going to quote him in length, so buckle your seatbelts. I want you to see how beautifully he could evoke the wonder of the scene, of this scene. He writes, speaking of the region between the upper and lower falls, he says, the river, though bordered by lofty precipices, expands in width and flows gently over a nearly level surface until its near approach to the verge. Here, a sudden convergence in the rocks compresses its channel with a gurgling, choking struggle. It leaps with a single bound, sheer from an even shelf into a tremendous chasm. The sheet could not be more perfect if wrought by art. The Almighty has vouchsafed no grander scene to human eyes. Every object that meets the vision increases its sublimity. There is a majestic harmony in the whole, which I've never seen before in nature's greatest works. The fall itself takes a leap between the jaws of rocks, whose vertical height above is more than 600 feet and more than 900 feet above the chasm into which it falls. Long before it reaches the base, it is enveloped in spray, which is woven by the sun's rays into bows radiant with all the colors of the prism, and arching the face of the cataract with their glories. Langford and other explorers scrambled around the falls, choosing favorite places from which to enjoy the sights. Langford tells us that he and Judge Hedges sat on a table rock opposite the upper falls as long as our limited time would permit. And as we reluctantly left it and climbed to the top, I expressed my regret at leaving so fascinating a spot, quoting the familiar line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." This stupendous display of nature's handiwork will be to me a joy forever. It lingers in my memory like the faintly defined outlines of a dream. I can scarcely realize that in the unbroken solitude of this majestic range of rocks, away from civilization and almost inaccessible to human approach, the Almighty has placed so many of the most wonderful and magnificent objects of his creation, and that I am to be one of the first few to bring them to the notice of the world. As I took in this scene, still quoting from Langford, I realized my own littleness, my helplessness, my dread exposure to destruction, my inability to cope with or even comprehend the mighty architecture of nature. More than all of this, I felt as never before my entire dependence upon that almighty power who had wrought these wonders. In the beauty of Langford's imagery, the precision of his prose, the display of his personal feelings, and his association of sublime nature with the Almighty, this passage is reminiscent of the writing of another apostle of wilderness, the Scots-American who published his very first article at this time, John Muir. Having visited the falls and traveling through many other wonders of the region, Langford and his companions made their way back, a month later, north toward the settlements. At this point, they thought they'd seen all that Yellowstone had to offer. Langford writes, "When we left Yellowstone Lake 2 days ago, the desire for home had superseded all thought of further explorations. 5 days of rapid travel would, we believed, bring us to the upper valley of the Madison and within 25 miles of Virginia City." Oh, I thought maybe you were just waving to me. Thank you. Okay. Well, I don't want to be lost, that's for sure. And I don't want Langford to be lost particularly. We're doing better now? Okay. Okay, so where I was when we left Yellowstone late 2 days ago, the desire for home had superseded all thought of future explorations. And I'm a little nervous now. Is this trouble is if I do this, then you get the popping all the time. That's better. Right here, okay. We had, within a distance of 50 miles, seen what we believed to be the greatest wonders on the continent. We were convinced that there was not on the globe another region where within the same limits nature had crowded so much of grandeur and majesty with so much of novelty and wonder. Judge then our astonishment on entering this basin to see at no great distance before us an immense body of sparkling water, over 100, projected suddenly and with terrific force into the air to a height of 100 feet. We found a real geyser. In the valley before us were 1,000 hot springs of various sizes and character, and 500 craters jetting forth vapor. Imagine this scene for a moment. Today, when you go to Yellowstone, you already know the geysers are there. You may well have seen them in films and read about them in books. You park your car, you walk along a crowded pathway to a wide circle of benches where you join a crowd of perhaps 1,000 tourists waiting to see Old Faithful erupt. You know within a few minutes when the eruption will occur because signs have listed eruption times almost as precisely as times for the showings of a film. Then steam hisses from a low hill 100 yards away, and next a column of water shoots high into the air. Even today, the spectacle is thrilling. But try to imagine coming to this scene 150 years ago with no one else around you except your companions. Imagine you had never seen a geyser. Imagine, in other words, that you were a member of the Washburn-Langford expedition. What would it be like seeing all of these geysers for the first time? Fortunately, Nathaniel Langford and others wrote accounts of what it was like. The explorers spent a day and a night among the geysers, amazed at their power and variety, and they gave many of them the names that endure to this day. Langford writes, I have just described General Washburn has named Old Faithful because of the regularity of his eruptions. So arguably the most famous wilderness icon in America is Old Faithful. Almost, I think pretty much everybody knows there's an Old Faithful. And even probably around the world, it's one of the most iconic scenes. And it's General Washburn on this expedition that gives it its name. Among other geysers, they named the Giant, the Giantess, the Grotto, and the Castle. General Washburn described the men's reactions to seeing the Giantess erupt. Standing and looking down into the stream of vapor of the crater of the Giantess with the sun upon your back, the shadows surrounded by a beautiful rainbow. The scene is grandly magnificent, each of the broken atoms of water shining like so many diamonds, while myriads of rainbows are dancing attendants. No wonder then that our usually staid and sober companions threw up their hats and shouted with ecstasy at the sight. I just love that. Just think of that. They threw up their hats and shouted with ecstasy. At 9:30 in the morning on September 19, the packers broke camp. Langford and a few others lingered, eager to see just one more magnificent eruption from the Giantess, but none occurred, and they departed, following their companions down the Firehole River to a broad plain where it meets the Gibbon and forms the Madison, and that's what's in your picture, that point. Here they camped for the night and engaged in a remarkable conversation. Langford writes, last night and also this morning in camp, the entire party had a rather unusual discussion. The proposition was made by some member that we utilize the result of our exploration by taking up quarter sections of land at the most prominent points of interest, and a general discussion followed. By controlling access to the greatest Yellowstone wonders, they could enrich themselves by charging admission. One member of the party suggested taking up a quarter section of land at the Upper Geyser Basin for the reason that locality could be more easily reached by tourists and pleasure seekers who would have to pay them for access to the falls. And by the way, one of the precedents at this point was Niagara Falls, where pretty much the entire circumference of the falls was surrounded by private shops and stuff, and you had to pay to see the falls. So that was a precedent that was available. Others suggested different ways of dividing and profiting from private claims near the wonders they had all seen. At this point, Langford tells us, Mr. Hedges then said that he did not approve of any of these plans, that there ought to be no private ownership of any portion of that region, but that the whole of it ought to be set aside as a great national park, and that each one of us ought to make an effort to have this accomplished. His suggestion met with an instantaneous and favorable response. Our purpose to create a park can only be accomplished by untiring work and concerted action in a warfare against the incredulity and unbelief of our national legislators. When our proposals shall be presented for their approval, nevertheless, I believe we can win the battle. I do not know of any portion of our country where a national park can be established, furnishing to visitors more wonderful attractions than here. These wonders are so different from anything we have ever seen. They are so various, so extensive, that the feeling in my mind for the moment they began to appear until we left them has been one of intense surprise and incredulity. Even every day spent in surveying them has revealed to me some new beauty. A few days later, the members of the expedition were back in the settlements. They did not, however, forget their resolve to engage in untiring work and concerted action against the incredulity with which reports from Yellowstone had until then been received. In this, they were successful. In less than a year and a half after their return to Upper Yellowstone, the world's first national park was created. The vital role of the Washburn-Langford expedition in the creation of Yellowstone National Park was honored in 1972 by a monument at Madison Junction, where the campfire decision takes place. And in that photo that I've given you, you can see a tiny, the monument is, that stone object in the foreground is the monument. And don't worry if you can't read it on the picture. How are you doing? Are you able to read it? I'll be reading it to you. The vital role of the Washburn-Langford expedition, monument. Okay, a bronze plaque mounted on the stone reads, "Here at the junction of the Fire Hole and Gibbon Rivers on September 19, 1870, members of the Washburn-Langford Doan expedition gathered around a campfire the last evening of their historic exploration of the Yellowstone country," still reading from that monument, "and discussed the astonishing natural wonders they had seen. There emerged an idea expressed by Judge Cornelius Hedges that there should be no private ownership of these wonders, but that the area should be preserved for public enjoyment. Others shared these views, and on March 1, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed an act establishing Yellowstone as the world's first national park." So that's the plaque you could still read that's out there today. At the lower left-hand corner of the plaque is an engraving showing men sitting beside a campfire. In the foreground, standing with his back toward the viewer, a man appears to be addressing the rest of the group. Apparently, this is Cornelius Hedges making his plea for the national park. This is all well and good, as it should be, but inside a tourist cabin overlooking the site is a bulletin board with a troubling message. A small notice printed on paper titled "The Campfire Myth" declares, campfire myth, by the way, and let's just block that word or legend from our thinking when we talk about Yellowstone. So here's what this notice says. "Much has been written about the campfire here at Madison Valley, where the idea of a national park is said to have originated. While first-hand accounts dispel this legend, there's no doubt that early explorers stood in this spot and marveled at the wonders of Yellowstone. We hope you do too. As far as I can tell, this is the official policy today on the campfire story." And notice I'm going to use the story, not legend, not myth. "That it never happened," that's the official policy. "That Langford made it up. I saw this message on that sign, and I heard it last summer from a ranger at Madison Junction and another ranger at West Yellowstone. I told those rangers that I'm researching this topic, and I'm pretty sure that Langford was telling the truth. Stay tuned," I said to the rangers. I'm glad to say that those rangers were friendly and interested. Just as I've needed to present a streamlined history today of the actual Washburn-Langford expedition, I will have only time now to provide a brief review of the evidence in support of Langford's truthfulness. Let's start with that sign in the visitor's cabin. It claims, "First-hand accounts dispel this legend." Well, they don't. True, there were many first-hand accounts of the expedition as a whole, varying in length from short news items to longer articles and reports. And true, none of them, including those by Langford, mention the fireside conversation. Langford's diary, published 35 years later, provides the account from which I've been quoting, and additionally, Judge Hedges wrote later that he did, in fact, suggest the national park idea at Madison Junction. My objection to this statement that the first-hand accounts dispel the legend is that it suggests that these accounts actually say there was no such conversation. Dispel. They don't. They don't mention it at all. Given the importance that history is given to the fireside story, one can reasonably ask, why didn't anyone mention it at the time? The answer is simple. The expedition diaries and notes are devoted almost entirely to geological features. Only Nathaniel Langford delighted in recording personal details and conversations. So the lack of contemporary accounts of this fireside conversation is no evidence whatsoever that it never occurred. 2, another common objection to the fireside story is the claim that it oversimplifies the actual process of creating Yellowstone National Park. There's a lot more to park building, the argument goes, than a campfire conversation. The Atlas of Yellowstone makes this claim in its entry on National Park Mountain, which overlooks Madison Junction. This entry reads, "This was supposedly the legendary," it's kind of hitting it twice, right? Supposedly the legendary. It tells you right off the bat that they don't believe it. This supposedly the legendary site where the 1870 Washburn Party discussed around their campfire the possibility of preserving Yellowstone as a great national park. More recent, and I'm still quoting from the Atlas, more recent historians believe this tale is apocryphal, perhaps made up by one of the park members, because the true story is much more complicated. Well, of course, the true story is much more complicated. No one has claimed that the campfire conversation had magical powers, as if it invoked some fairy godmother who waved a magic wand and said, let the national park be created, and it was done. Before the park could be established, a doubting public had to be persuaded that the wonders of Yellowstone even existed. Even members of Congress had to be persuaded to create something new in the world, a national park. Okay, here's the thing. Nathaniel Langford tells us that the members of the Yellowstone expedition knew that creating the national park would be a huge challenge. They didn't think they could just say it's a good idea and it would be done. They resolved at the campfire to undertake that challenge, beginning with publicizing what they'd seen. They had talked the talk, and next they needed to walk the walk, which they did in one newspaper article after another. The foremost publicist of them all was Nathaniel P. Langford. He published 2 articles on Yellowstone in Scribner's Magazine, containing his beautiful descriptions of geysers, lakes, and waterfalls. So what does that mean? What was Scribner's Magazine anyway? Think Life and Look from a few years ago. Scribner's was one of the preeminent journals of the time. And what about the placement of the articles? The back of the magazine? Only a few columns? To the contrary, Langford's Yellowstone articles were the lead articles in 2 successive issues of Scribner's, the lead articles. I had it checked, and in a 10-year run of the magazine, no one else ever had back-to-back lead articles. Finally, what about the influence of Langford's stories? Did anyone actually read them? In answering this question, I have at my disposal a wonderful research tool, newspapers.com. This is an online collection of almost 1 billion newspaper pages. In other words, probably 5 to 10 billion newspaper articles, 1 billion newspaper pages almost, allowing a scholar to undertake research unimaginable only a few years ago when historians began debunking the campfire story. Fortunately, in trying to discover whether Scribner's articles were gaining recognition elsewhere in the press, I was able to find a useful search term. And how are we doing on time? Because I have a slight 1-minute anecdote to add in. Are we okay? Well, of course, you don't know how much more I have.
7.
What's that?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, 24 pages. I think we're going to be okay. Newspapers.com is just for a teacher and for anyone doing research is an amazing resource. And when I started getting interested in national parks, I looked for what they were saying in national parks in the 50s and 60s and 70s, 1850s, 60s, 70s. And perversely, there was a bank in New York that had been the Park Bank that went national, and it became the National Park Bank. And just one hit after another was the darn National Park Bank instead of the national parks. And what I want to get at here is you have to have a good search term. And so I looked through the various words in Langford Scribner's articles, And at one point, he refers to Yellowstone Falls as a hideous gulf, which was a term of admiration. So I searched hideous gulfs, which is going to be a lot more specific than National Park Bank. And I had 51 hits, 51 newspapers around the country republished this, the article that appeared in Scribner's. Another indication of the reach of those Scribner's articles is that when both houses of Congress began to discuss a national park bill, Langford is in Washington, D.C., and placed copies of the article on the desks of every congressperson. Clearly, Nathaniel Langford was indeed walking the walk, anticipated by the conversation at Madison Junction. Another approach to debunking Langford is to assert that he claimed too much for himself in that fireside talk. In a moment, I will cite an example from Ken Burns. But first, I want to make it clear that I take second place to no person in my admiration for Ken Burns. Burns is the greatest historical documentary of our time, arguably of any time. His book, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, is a treasure. The book and film are the backbone of a course I teach at Eastern Washington on the history of national parks. If I were Secretary of the Interior or Director of the National Parks, I would decree that the book and DVD should be sold at every parks bookstore in the country. But that said, I regret to tell you that by relying, albeit understandably, on secondary sources of his time, Ken Burns signed on to the debunking of the fireside story. Here is what we read in the book he co-authored with Dayton Duncan after quoting from Langford's fireside story. This, according to Langford, was the birth of the national park idea, completely ignoring, and I'm quoting Burns now here, completely ignoring the quasi-precedent already set at Yosemite and even longer history leading up to it. Suffice it to say, in this instance, my hero is completely wrong. I don't know philosophy, but there must be a term for the logical flaw when someone misconstrues what another person says and then conflates the misconception with the actual statement and dismisses both. No, Nathaniel Langford never, ever claimed that the national park idea as a whole was born at Madison Junction, only that they discussed promoting the existing idea of a national park and making Yellowstone a national park. Moreover, in his writings, Langford often credits others with suggesting before him that, and his colleagues, that Yellowstone should be made a national park. Enough said. I will herewith tase my brain, removing that passage I just quoted, and return to my undying admiration for Ken Burns. And my notes here say tase brain, and I was trying to find a taser. I don't have one, and it's probably just as well. But at any rate, I'm going to forget that. Moving forward, I could say much more in the way of debunking the debunking, criticizing the debunking of the fireside conversation. But time is running out, so time is running out, so I have one more. In the meantime, bear with me for one more example. This one will bring us back to John Mullan himself, who you may recall helped set in motion the Washburn-Langford expedition. Another criticism of Langford's account claims that it is unreliable because it does not sound like other expedition narratives of the time. One author states that he has read hundreds of expedition narratives, and none of them are written like Langford's. Well, I say more is the pity. Langford's account abounds in wonderful nature descriptions, engrossing conversation, flashes of humor, appealing historical quotations, scientific observations, and great descriptions of men and animals. But that hardly makes it unreliable. I, too, have read hundreds of travel accounts, and I've read others with some of these same prose qualities. So that does not mean it's false because it has these extra qualities. We know for certain that Langford read one such report, and his prose might well have been influenced by that other explorer's, who was noted for his felicitous blending of prose and precision. Langford acquired a copy of this book before he visited the Upper Yellowstone, and he still owned it more than 35 years later. Can you guess who the author of that book was? In my classes at a point like this, if I'm in a playful mood, I like to say something like, who was he? His name rhymes with sullen and begins with M. Why, of course, John Mullan. And Mullan also had a flair for prose. If for no other reason, we should admire Nathaniel Langford because Langford admired John Mullan, right? We'll all agree with that, I hope. But of course, there are many other reasons, very good ones at that, for believing Langford and his campfire story, as I hope I have persuaded you today. In closing, there's one more reason to believe the campfire story. Properly understood, it is an uplifting tale. It's a wonderful story. Men from Montana, hooray, acting on their own initiative, hooray, and using their own money, were the first to visit and widely report on the wonders of Yellowstone. They could easily have laid claim to valuable plots of land around the falls and geysers. They could have done that. But instead, they set in motion the process that led to the foundation of the world's first national park. The campfire story is worth telling because it is so inspiring. Moreover, it is worth telling because it is true. Thank you.
September 19th. At about 10 o'clock.
I've always put in that the man who first discovered, or came up with the idea of Yellowstone Park was a pugilist in Virginia City around 1866 named John Mullan. And he stood on the back of his preacher. He ran a saloon. And there's evidence that he first proclaimed that this park should be, or this region should be saved.
When we're finished, I want to take a note of that, because in my book, I want to mention this earlier in the work.
I think I can talk loud enough. It's what Tom Inkler is saying, that he somewhere saw, he related that Con Oram, who was a pugilist, maybe you want to turn around and try to remember what you just said.
Well, that he suggests.
Got the idea started.
Con Oram was a bare-fisted, what do you call it, pugilist in Virginia City in the 1860s, mid-1860s. And Leviathan Hall, which was no longer there in Virginia City, he had 169 or 68 round boxing match with another gentleman. I mean, he was a tough hombre. And he had a saloon, obviously, and on Sundays he would jump up on his buckboard and talk about how we should save the Yellowstone region, preserve it from hunters and other people.
I want to make a note of that because in my book, there definitely are other people before, but the whole point about that, though, is did he then write articles in Scribner's? Did people all across the country know about Yellowstone because of it? So that's what's unique about this particular expedition, is they really revealed to the world, and without that, you never have Congress passing the bills that it passed.
There's one historical study publication that talks about it. It's a slave biography, or a Greek biography.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great story, too. Other comments, questions, or anybody from Wyoming want to complain about my extolling the Montana roll?
How much stuff do you have, Langford or that's written before then? Because the argument against him being said that comes from an article that he wrote, 35 years later in his diary on campfire, and it talks about the people and what they said. Is there evidence earlier than that was his writing style, that he had a very good
Absolutely.
ability to transcribe
Yeah, and we have two major sources, and in the fuller book, I'll be exploring that much more completely. But what I was quoting from as being very accessible is mainly something written quite a bit later. But the Scribner's articles, and I've compared them a lot. There's more in the book, but the Scribner's articles are within a year of the expedition. And we know that he had that writing style. He also wrote a book about vigilante days in Montana that it also comes later, but it shows some of his writing style. But it's definitely the way he writes.
And are those articles and Scribner's, are those the articles that came from, who was the Henry Village, invited into the mansion back east to give, present arguments on the park, and we did a series of about a dozen talks. I'm wondering if those are published.
The talks, again, it's the wonder of newspapers.com, because I've read accounts of the talks. For example, the New York Times covered him when he was speaking in New York. He covered in talked in Washington, D.C. Hayden, who led a government expedition into the park a year later, was at the lecture that Langford gave in Washington, D.C. By the way, Hayden came back, and some people credit Hayden, he had 40 men or something, and had in our dollars millions of dollars of money. But basically, he confirmed what Langford had already publicized. And I think he had an article in Scribner's. You can see I'm a big fan of Langford, but it was a much shorter article, and it came later. So it's definitely Langford and that group that made this story known throughout the country. And I saw a hand up over here somewhere. Yes.
So you mentioned at the beginning of your talk John Muir, and did I get that right? I think you mentioned John Muir.
I did, yeah.
And there was it seems like there was almost a pivotal moment in American history when the wilderness became regarded not as a hostile place, but as a place of romance and wonder.
Yeah.
And that this feels like it's right on the cusp of that moment, and that the language of Langford resembles that of John Muir, although John Muir was, I think, still a young man at the time.
Yeah, his first article was published, I think, in 1871. So Muir his career is just beginning as this expedition ends. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned, you're Peter, right? Yeah. Nice to see you. We'll talk more. Yeah, okay. Peter Stark. I'd like to say that not only were the members of the Langford party at that campfire, but John Muir was there. John Muir isn't a good example. I should say Henry David Thoreau was there. Ralph Waldo Emerson was there. It was in the air. People, for the last 20, 30 years, you begin to see Americans appreciating wilderness. And there's a marvelous book on this, Wilderness in the American Mind by Roderick Nash, which is the classic account of the developing love of wilderness in America. But that was there. I mean, those folks were, and at various points, remember that Langford quotes, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." And actually Judge Hedges says to him, "Now where's that from?" And they both kind of struggle, and it turns out it's from something called Childe Harold. But these were people that were very well educated, literary. They had a lot of quotes from literature and so on that they would be aware of. And so that was in the air. And one reason I'm when I started researching this a while back, I thought I smelled a rat in terms of the debunking of all of this. But I still had doubts along the way. And the more I've explored it, the more I'm persuaded that this really happened. And one of the reasons I quote in such detail about the description of the falls and of the geysers is these people were really excited. They loved what they saw. They were like kids, And as a reference point, if it had been 50 years earlier, they would have gone right to, we can make money here. And you could see that they were thinking about that, and it's very natural that that would be part of it. But it wasn't just, they didn't invent the idea of of a national park. The literature on that gets confused by national park bank getting in the way. But there was talk of making a national park in D.C. of the monuments, the man-made monuments in Washington, D.C. And Yosemite was already a state park because Yosemite, it was a state when Yosemite became a park in the Civil War. California was already a state. If Montana and Wyoming had already been states, maybe this would have been a state park, but they were territories. But at any rate, yeah, people were thinking of parks, so there could be a reference point. And definitely John Muir was part of this going forward and taking it to yet another level. Well, I hope that for the good of the truth and also for the good of Montana and maybe even for the good of private enterprise that you go forward and the next time you're in Yellowstone, Yosemite, and they say, well, recent historians have said that it was true. You could say, well, I heard a recent historian who said that it is true.
Thanks, Bill.